The last night of Amos Huckabee. Sometimes Amos knew when he was about to wake up. The only part of a dream he ever remembered was the last few minutes before he would wake. What went on before he could never recall. On the rare times that he was aware in his dreams, he knew that soon he was to wake, almost like knowing the future. Strange, but consistent. And so tonight it came as no surprise that his dream abruptly ended. A shame, since it was not a nightmare. What surprised him was who was standing above him, shaking him awake. It was Neville, his pale face all scratched up, skin flush and out of breath. He said, "Wake up, Amos. This time we hit it big." He gave a loud hoot and clapped his hands. "We've been eating like kings tonight, but the captain has asked for you." Amos knew what that meant. He must have slept through the whole thing. He couldn't believe it had worked so well. What was it that he added to his tea? Although forced awake, he was surprised how quickly and vividly it came to him. It felt like his mind was wide open and still sharp at the same time. "Oh," he said out loud in a surprised tone. It was the ground thorn mantis antler. Maybe it interacted with the aurora. Imagine that. He told himself he will have to keep a log and start a proper experiment this week. That was one reason he rose to chief cook so quickly. He had a knack of finding a use for new and obscure things found in the field. It was said Amos could make hardtack appetizing. After his assignment to the galley, he quickly became the favorite of both crew and captain, all three captains so far. Neville hurried off after Amos told him he would take care of things. He got dressed, but was delayed in finding his headset. Placing them over his ears, he chose to listen to some of the classics, the Northern Lights from Neon. Turning the volume up, he stepped into the passageway. Amos started toward the galley but made sure to keep his eyes forward and not drift into any open cabins. He had already prepared the captain's meal. As he finished the other tray, he smiled to himself. This one was much simpler, broth in a mug, crackers and whiskey. He placed it on a lower rack of the serving cart underneath a white sheet. As he pushed the loaded cart down the hallway, Amos started to think about his dream. It puzzled him that the end hadn't faded. That would be strange in and of itself if not for the fact the whole dream seemed just within reach. No time for that now, he told himself. He wanted to be finished and back in his cabin before the celebration spilled into the passageways. Amos removed the headset from his too early graying hair and knocked. "Come," came a strong older voice. When Amos heard the voice, he was hit with a strong feeling of déjà vu. He shook it off and pushed in the cart to find the captain sitting in his favorite chair, naked as the day he was born. In his early 60s, the captain still maintained his muscular build under a thick layer of fat. With short-cropped salt and pepper hair and a white beard, his eyes were closed, and between puffs of his cigar he quietly said, "Thank you, Amos." After the tray was set next to his chair, the captain breathed in deep through his nose and shook his head with a grunt. "Go ahead, she's in there," he said, nodding his head toward a half-open door. Amos looked over and felt another strong wave of déjà vu. Grimly, he pushed the cart into the captain's bunk. He was no medic, but Amos had improved at tending wounds over the last 15 years. Taking in the scene, he realized this woman was not going to be ransomed. She would be sold to an organ farm. She was in her late 40s and in bad shape. Judging the color of her bruising, he decided most of those were taken during the capture of the luxury liner. She was curled up and asleep. Amos selected a different playlist, set his Walkman on the bed, and gently placed the headset over her ears. He then pulled out the med kit that was strapped to the underside of the cart. The captain knew that Amos kept it there, but he didn't know all of it. If he did, Amos would have been spaced, chief cook or not. As he opened the secret compartment, he felt a forlorn sadness sweep through him. This was his penance. He would stay here and help those he could. The worst off, he would grant freedom. So far, Amos had perfected 8 poisons. Their effects he could generally match to the injuries suffered. Taking a moment, he chose one. It would be peaceful for her. He mixed the poison in with the whiskey. He shook off that annoying feeling of déjà vu, cradled her like a large child, and drew the glass toward her lips. Suddenly, her eyes shot open and locked on his. Amos dropped the glass and gasped as his dream, the entire dream, came back to him in that moment. She firmly grasped his head in her hands. Green, bloodshot eyes searched his face. "Emil," she whispered, "find your sister and take her far from here. Save her. Remember what your father told you before they killed him." Sister? This woman was delirious, but he remembered this moment and what he was to do next. He held her as she sobbed into his chest. Then he laid her down and covered her up. He took several minutes to gather himself and let his heart rate go down. Amos sat next to her and removed the headset still on her head. He placed the medkit scalpel in her left hand, squeezed it closed, and said, "Mother, I will find Tyann and take her to your aunt at New Atlantis." What Amos did next, he didn't remember in his dream, but it seemed right. He pressed his finger to her neck and whispered, "This is the jugular. The man is in a chair outside. He should be asleep soon." Amos left his Walkman behind. He didn't need it anymore. He took the cart back to his quarters and gathered a few essential things. Most important was his journal on fauna and xenobiology, his good set of knives, and his most important discovery yet. The secret that kept him sane, that helped him forget the very worst of days. Finally, he placed a dark sheet over the cart and headed back to the galley. After a quick stop at the armory, he arrived at the cell block. It took no coaxing to get the guards to eat what he prepared. As they were eating, he delivered food to the prisoners through the door slots. It wasn't long before the guards passed out. He didn't need to look to know which cell Tyann was in. She would be with 8 others in the cell. He knew it was overkill, but left with no other choice. Amos put a respirator on, dropped the sleep grenade in through the door slot, and slammed it shut. After a full 5 minutes, he opened the slot and watched the bodies carefully. They all were breathing evenly. Not knowing who else was in there, he had to be careful since most shipmen were trained to hold their breath for at least 5 minutes. He pocketed the canister and found the girl, Tyann, sheltered between 2 women. Amos gently picked her up and propped her against the cart. He found his thermos in the pack and poured some cool tea into its lid. Looking at her again and guessing her body weight, he poured some back in the thermos. In the tea was his secret, a mixture that he slowly perfected over the years. He dribbled the whole serving down her throat while stroking her neck so she wouldn't choke. If he got the serving right, when she wakes, she would have lost all memory of the previous 10 hours. Amos placed her on the pallet he had prepared on the bottom of the serving cart. Back at the kitchen, he removed all the trays and rigged it so she would be comfortable but not have a hand or leg drop out during the next part of his plan. "Amos!" came a cheerful voice. The guard at the airlock leading to the luxury liner was none other than Kirsten, Amos' biggest fan. The man was easily 300 pounds. When they met 3 years ago, he was only a stocky 200. As Amos drew close to the airlock, Kirsten made his way to the cart. Seeing only Amos's pack on top, he made a disappointed sigh and went to look under the sheet hiding the girl. Amos quickly put his hand on Kirsten's shoulder and said, "Sorry, pal. I have nothing for you tonight. I just finished with the captain and want to see if I can find some interesting stock in the ship's pantry." Amos winked as he said this. "Well," Kirsten drew out, "the captain ordered that no one go aboard until he and Maris take stock of the loot. No one gets in for any early dipping of our cut." "That's too bad," Amos said. "I'd hate for someone to look through the ship's stores who doesn't know the difference between syntha-meat steak and a patty melt." He put on a disappointed face and started to turn around when Kirsten quickly said, Amos, wait. I'll let you look around if you promise to make me something special. Like you would the captain. Most of the escape pods were jettisoned during the firefight earlier, but he found one close enough to the bridge, placed Tyann inside and buckled her in. He watched her for a moment, just to be sure the effects of the gas were still holding, and left for the bridge. My name is Emil Buchanan. My sister and I are passengers on the Oasis of the Stars. We have been captured by the Crimson Fleet. Somebody help us, please. We don't have much time. Amos depressed the key and then launched the distress beacons. All of them. On the monitor, he could see flashes as their FTLs engaged. It wouldn't be long now. Amos prepared himself for what was going to happen next. He waited until he heard the sound of boots slapping down the hallway. By the time it reached him, the gasping breath of Kirsten was louder than the sound of his heavy footsteps. Amos leaned on the control panel, back toward the open bulkhead, and then stood straight. "Amos!" came the panicked voice of Kirsten. Silence except for the sounds of the panels beeping and Kirsten's heavy breathing. "Amos!" This time the cracks of emotion broke through. "What have you done? You've killed us all. Why?" Amos turned to see his friend pointing a pistol at him. His hand was shaking, and tears started to build up in his eyes. At that, Amos moved. He moved fast. He threw the knife he had palmed for this very moment. Except this time, he adjusted the throw. The butt of the knife hit Kirsten squarely in the forehead. Stunned, he reeled back and fired his pistol to the side. Amos rushed him and slammed a two-handed fist on the top of Kirsten's head, knocking him clean out. Amos picked up the gun and tossed it to the other side of the bridge. He took a moment to catch his breath and took in the scene with a loud exhale. So the dream wasn't set in stone. He wasn't locked into a specific fate. That made sense. He didn't break the universe. The dream was a likely possibility, but not a predetermined collapse of the wave function. That gave Amos some comfort. He didn't like how the dream showed his confrontation with Kirsten. He picked up his knife and put it in Kirsten's belt. Amos hoped he would get the message. He jogged back to the escape pod. Tyann was still fast asleep, and if all went well, she wouldn't remember this night. His pack was already inside, and he made sure to have no weapons on him. He buckled, flipped the safety, and hit the eject button. The jolt woke her. She started, wide-eyed and groggy. Amos reached over and took her head in his hands. "Tyann, it's okay. There was an accident on the ship, and your mother told me to get you to safety. Everything will be okay, child. Everything will be okay." With that, the persistent déjà vu ended, and Amos Huckabee came to the end of his dream. That's why he didn't want to wake up from it. He thought he was finally a hero. Too bad there can be no heroes in this broken universe. The United Colony's interrogation room was clean and bright. White plasteel panels lined the walls. The floor was of burnished aluminum. What surprised Amos was the table. It was old and made of wood. It had to be priceless. He sat freely with no restraints and took that as a good sign. He was still thinking about that table when the door opened and two officers walked in. A female lieutenant, about 30 years old, followed by a fleet admiral. He was in his early 60s, of dark skin with a shaved head and impressive white mustache. Amos looked up and made eye contact with the older man. The admiral studied Amos and held his gaze longer than was comfortable. In a slow tone, the man said, "Emil Buchanan was not found among the survivors. Yet the distress call we received seemed to come from him. And you, not Emil, were found in the pod with his sister." Amos looked away. After a moment, he took a breath and said, "I sent it. The message." The admiral grunted and nodded, followed by an expectant stare with eyebrows raised. "My name is Amos Huckabee. I am a pirate of the Crimson Fleet." Amos told most of his story. his position as chief cook of the pirate ship Butcher's Bill, and his efforts to help those stolen and enslaved, including his euthanizing of the worst victims. He outlined the events of the previous night, with the exception of the dream. When he finished, the lieutenant's hand was to her mouth, and the admiral's eyes were squinting and looking off thoughtfully. After a moment, he sat down across from Amos, hands clasped on the table. "My name is Admiral Jackson Smalley. The girl you saved is special to me and important to greater people than myself." He looked over at the lieutenant, and she handed him a signed paper. The admiral took a pen and filled in what looked to be Amos's name. "This here is a pardon, Amos, signed and stamped. I hope you use it well in your next life." After the lieutenant scanned it, he slid it over to Amos, who just stared at it sickly. "Not the reaction I expected, Huckabee," Smalley said. "I am curious. Why did you put yourself on the line all those years? Such a thing is rarely done out of benevolence." Amos whispered something. "Speak up, son," the admiral said impatiently. "I was on Narrated 7, Amos repeated. Admiral Smalley looked puzzled and said, "Narrated. There were no survivors there. I would know." Then his eyes grew hard as stone, and he crumpled the paper sitting between them. In a eerily calm voice, he ordered, "Sally, step outside, please." "Admiral?" came the perplexed question. "Lieutenant!" he yelled. She quickly exited the room and closed the door. His eyes bored hard into Amos. Smalley was breathing rapidly through his nose. "My frigate was the one to capture the beast and her crew. They were all publicly hanged, the whole lot of them." As he said this, he slammed a fist into the table. Amos looked at him and without a word shook his head. The admiral reeled back at this and ran his hand through his non-existent hair, finally resting his head in his hands, pinching the bridge of his nose. They sat in silence for several minutes. Amos knew he would soon pay his debt. He was okay with that. Now he could just go to sleep without the nightmares. "I request to have the injection," Amos said. What he heard next chilled him to his core. The admiral, shaking his head, started to laugh in a low, gravelly tone. "Nothing so quick or painless as that," he said. "Somehow you eluded the greatest manhunt in a generation. Joined another pirate crew without their knowledge of your past. Then, under their noses, you maintained your own personal crusade for over a decade. Finally, when it suited you, you single-handedly mutinied and orchestrated the capture of your entire crew and vessel. Over the last 2 months, all of our operatives in the Crimson Fleet have gone dark. Before we lost communication, we started to hear of changes in their upper levels of command. Even now, our reports of ship movements and raids outside their normal area of influence are disturbing. We are blind and need eyes in the field." Amos Huckabee had the look of a man that was watching a bullet coming straight for his head. Closing his eyes, the admiral said, "The record will show Amos Huckabee was killed during the capture of the Butcher's Bill. I want you," the admiral continued in a commanding voice, "to join the Crimson Fleet as a new recruit. Rise their ranks and tell me what is going on over there. I would normally call it a death sentence, since no one has been able to make it to the top without being found out. But then again, you have experience staying below the radar. Do this for me, and if you survive, I will call your debt paid." "But Admiral," Amos pleaded, "to do that, I will have to be a monster again." The admiral almost looked pityingly. He clicked his tongue and said, "Our section of the galaxy only has relative peace because we allow the Crimson Fleet to exist. If we moved in and wiped them out, it would create room for 100 different pirate groups to form with no internal rules or pirate codes to keep them in check. To prevent that, we must allow the sacrifice of a few innocent to sustain a manageable chaos. We mustn't allow the Crimson Fleet to take more than we allow them to. If they do, it will upset the balance, and we will be forced to war." He leaned in closer to Amos and softened his voice. "You're smart. You had to have made it this far. I bet you will be able to save more lives than you take. And I know the information you feed us will save far more than you ever could on your own." "The woman," Amos asked, "is she okay?" "She's alive," Smalley replied. Slowly nodding his head, Amos said, "All right, I'll do it." The Admiral took in a full breath and said, "Good. I'm going to keep this off the books. I don't believe it a coincidence that all our moles went silent at once. Just to be sure, I'm going to make the arrangements myself and ship you out during the night shift. I have a couple people in a mining operation I've used from time to time in our witness relocation program. I will sign you up as a miner with no questions asked. When the time is right, the two operatives, Heller and Lynn, will approach you to work out your new identity, and may even be able to do some basic gene modding to change your appearance." "Okay," Amos said. "It's a 6-month mining contract," Smalley said, "but I may have you pulled before. Until then, keep your head down and be forgettable." Amos nodded, and with that the Admiral tapped his watch and called for Sally. She came in and placed Amos's Walkman on the table. The Admiral got up to leave and said, "Monica, the woman you saved wanted you to have this back." Alone again, he waited for his escort. Amos was thinking about his soon-to-be stint as a miner and hoped he would have the whole 6 months. It would be the most peaceful and uneventful time of his adult life. He would have to change his name again. When he joined the crew of the Butcher's Bill, he chose to be Amos but kept his last name Huckabee. He would need to drop that now, but he will still be Amos. He knew what the name meant. He reached for his Walkman and turned it on. As he flipped through the menu, he noticed a new song was added that very morning. Curious, he selected it.
I was a highwayman. Along the coach roads I did ride, with a sword and pistol by my side. Many a young maid lost her baubles to my trade. Many a soldier shed his lifeblood on my blade. The bastards hung me in the spring of 25, but I'm still alive. And I was a sailor, and I was born upon the tide. With the sea I did abide. I sailed a schooner around the Horn of Mexico. I went aloft to furl the mainsail and blow. When the yards broke off, they said that I got killed, but I'm living still. I was a dam builder, across this river deep and wide, where steel and water did collide, in a place called Boulder on the wild Colorado. But I slipped and fell into the wet concrete below. They buried me in that great tomb that knows no sound, but I'm still around, and I'll always be around and around and around. And I flew a starship across the universe divide. When I reach the other side, I'll find a place to rest my spirit if I can. Perhaps I may become a highwayman again. Or I may simply be a single drop of rain. And I will remain, and I'll come back